Immanuel Kant, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Let's start in discussing Kant with a related ethical theory which is called Divine Command Theory, or DCT. So DCT is a theory that states that the ethical theory that right and wrong are the results of God's commandments. And here, in thinking about DCT, the Ten Commandments serve as the paradigmatic example. These are the commandments that come from the Old Testament Bible. So DCT is a moral theory which explains morality in a variety of ways. It serves as a foundation for right and wrong because God is that foundation. It explains some of the rules and norms we have in society. You can say that these are derived from God's commands. It helps us to understand conscience and guilt. Conscience and guilt, we're guilty and we feel a conscience in reference to God's commands. Of course, the problem with DCT is that in order to accept it, you have to first accept that God exists. So let's say if I deny that God exists, then DCT falls. So recognizing this, and this is a theory that comes out of ancient thought and Judeo-Christian thought. Philosophers sought a kind of more, let's say, non-religious based type of ethics, which kind of relies on this notion of commands, which is where we're taking our particular study at present. So now let's look at what a command is and first distinguish that from a counsel. So we have a statement, do this or do not do this, and both of them could seem like commands, but in fact you can distinguish them. Now this particular statement, this distinction comes out of Hobbes, who was a 17th century philosopher, in his Leviathan. He states a command is something we do because an authority states it, okay, and for no other reason. So in this case, it's an absolute decision of a ruler or a law in relation to a ruler or government, and we ought to do it even if it isn't beneficial to us. So this is what makes it a command. And we have to do it simply because it has been commanded. I think we're all familiar with these types of commands. Now, counsel is a type of command which is different. We do it because one is well advised to do so. For example, there could be the counsel that, one shouldn't smoke because you'll get sick. And that's a kind of counsel, but not really a command. So it's akin to a command, but it's more like a giving of advice. It's rooted in a practical sense of wisdom, in other words, how we ought to act. And we generally follow these types of counsels because in doing so we might derive some benefit from it. Now, DCT, or divine command theory, would be understood to be tied to a command in this primary sense up here. So this moves us into deontology. So deontology is similar to DCT, but it's a little different. It's the ethical theory that right and wrong, like DCT, are the result of moral rules, duties, or obligations. This comes from the Greek, deon, meaning a rule or duty. So now, divine command theory is a type of deontology, right? Because with divine command theory, right and wrong are the result of God's commands. Now, deontology, however, is broader, and there are deontological theories that are not just DCT. And we're going to talk about Kant, who will have just that. So we have the examples, all the examples that would also fit into DCT, but don't necessarily need to. Don't kill, don't lie, don't steal. And just as a side note, deontology, as opposed to, for example, utilitarianism, is a non-consequentialist ethical theory. Because right and wrong is rooted in moral rules or commands, the consequences really don't matter. So right and wrong are kind of independent of those consequences and instead depend upon duty. So, for example, suppose that lying leads to a good consequence for a deontologist, and even for DCT, it would be wrong to lie. Okay? So Kant's particular theory in his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals is an example of DCT. Kant himself is perhaps one of the most significant philosophers in modern thought. His work led to deep revolutions in philosophical thinking during the 18th century, Enlightenment era. And his particular theory, which he develops here, this deontology, a kind of rule-bound ethics, is distinct from DCT because for Kant, following this Enlightenment era where we kind of have to live autonomously and be free thinking. It's based upon the idea that these duties are based upon rational commands that follow from rational agents, so us as individuals, and that in a way we give the moral law to ourselves. Okay, so what we're going to do is figure out, well, what does Kant mean by this, and how does this in fact apply? So the first thing we get into is some technical stuff here. It's the distinction between a priori and a posteriori propositions, which issues from Kant's philosophy as a whole. Now, a proposition is a statement which is, usually we would say in philosophy, truth functional. In other words, the statement is tied to an assessment that could either be said such that the statement is true or false. For example, if I say the sky is blue and it's blue, then it's true, so it's a proposition. If I say George Washington is the first U.S. president, well, that would also be true. If I say killing is wrong, now the idea is that this is a proposition, and Kant's going to recognize this. Okay, so why we could say, well, that's true too, or that's false. We could, of course, debate it, but that's what ethics is. Now, if I say ew, well, this isn't a proposition. It's kind of an emotional expression. For example, if I see something that's gross. Now, I put that note here. Emotivism is a later ethical theory in the 20th century that develops, tied to logical positivists. And it's the idea that ethical statements aren't really propositions, but rather non-propositional, non-cognitive states that kind of just express a feeling. Okay, so this is not Kant's theory. I'm just noting that just to show you that there's different views about whether this is even a proposition or not. Now, for Kant, this is a proposition, and from now on, we'll go on the basic supposition that that's the case. So he further distinguishes two kinds of propositions. So notice there's different propositions. Now he's going to distinguish between two different kinds. The first he calls a priori, and these are propositions that I know without having to look to experience in order to justify them. So if I say that 2 plus 3, if you say that 2 plus 3 is 5, and I say, well, give me proof, there's not much you could do but maybe throw up a few fingers and show me, or show me with some chairs, or show me by drawing it on the board. And the reason is that, numbers are not something that we actually see, but something that we cognize and abstractly know. So a proposition like 2 plus 3 is 5 would therefore be an a priori proposition. In this case, it's true. If it were 2 plus 3 is 4, the proposition would be false. A posteriori propositions are then the opposite. So the justification is acquired through appeal to experience. If I say the chair in my room black, is black, and you could say, well, justify it, and I say, well, let's go to my room, and I show you, and the chair is black, then the proposition is true, and otherwise it's false. So notice this one does not need a justification or appeal to experience. This type of proposition does. Now, Kant he's making this division because he wants to kind of identify, well, what is the basis of morality? And notice the text, the name of the text is groundwork. By that he means the basis or foundation. And in order to figure that out, he wants to figure out, well, if I say killing is wrong or it's never right to steal, how is our knowledge of this obtained? Do we obtain it through experience, that I see what the wrong is and know it just like I see that the chair is black? Or is it that I kind of already know what wrong is, and then whenever I see it, like 2 plus 3 is 5, I just know that it's either right or wrong? So this is not an easy question to answer, and sometimes our assumptions might be a little naive on this, and so Kant wants to clarify that. So he starts, in order to answer this, by distinguishing willing versus reasoning. And reasoning is basically when we think and when we make deductions and inferences and make arguments, and basically all logical thought, like if-then thinking. Okay, so morally speaking, this applies because we often have to deliberate over choices. So if I do that, then this will happen. If I do that, then this will happen. No, I should do this. So reason is involved there. And he also notes that reason is useful because through reasoning, we can rationally order ourselves to become a good person. So if we didn't have reason, like an animal, you really don't blame an animal for being morally good or bad. And part of the reason is that they just don't have reasoning. Okay, so with human reason, we can start to talk about good and bad. But reason is also tied to the will. And the will is the center of our intention and choice and decision. Now, the will kind of serves as the basis of your moral character, and really kind of when we speak of someone who is good or bad, it's not so much their reasoning, but rather their will. And this is kind of what we say about someone's character, that it's how they're willing. Why? Because a bad person is making use of reasoning, and they're saying, well, if I do this, I can get what I want, right? But we're going to say that this person is bad, and partly it's because they have bad intentions, and so it's tied to will in that sense. So what conditions do we need then in order to say that an action is moral, right? So I look at an action and I say, well, what makes that action right or wrong, okay? So Kant suggests that there's three conditions, and he's going to formulate three basic propositions on the basis of this. And the first one is that the action has to be a result of dutiful action. Stated otherwise, to have moral worth, an action must be done from duty. He distinguishes two senses here. It must be done either for the sake of duty itself, which is a kind of perfect duty. For example, I don't steal because I feel duty-bound not to steal. In other words, I just don't feel like it's right. I'm not going to take the watch even if it's there. It's not mine, you see? Or I find a wallet and it has money. I have to find the person and give it back because I just think it's right, and not for any other reason or gain or anything. So the second would be doing something out of duty for the sake of some other reason. This is imperfect duty. So I'm not stealing because, well, the law forbids it, and I don't really care for the law. I don't want to be punished. I would do it if I could get away with it, but I don't. So you're not really doing it out of a duty that you feel duty-bound to. That's the idea. So for Kant, and I think it's obvious, actions are moral, and they have the right to be claim moral worth, goodness, insofar as we act for the sake of duty itself. I want to point out here that the distinction is related to what we've already seen in Plato's Republic. You'll recall in the second book the distinction between types of goods, and where we have goods that are done for their own sake and for the benefits, those that are done for their own sake, and those that are done for the benefits. Well, we have this something like a distinction like that here. So the second maxim is that an action must be done, the second proposition is an action ought to be done from duty, obtains its moral worth from the maxim by which it is determined. Now, a maxim, and by this I mean a kind of moral maxim, is a subjective principle of action, or just a kind of practical principle of action that comes from us some way. So it's a rule on the basis of which you act, and usually we kind of give ourselves these rules. So, for example, I can make it a maxim, a principle of action, to give money to a specific charity every month. Okay, so what he's saying here is that if we're doing something from duty, then it should depend upon the maxim in order to determine whether it has moral worth. So what's the maxim you have underlying your action? Why are you doing it? That's the basic question. And third, duty is the necessity of acting from respect for the moral law. I think this is an important point, because he's saying you're not just acting because you feel duty-bound, and I just feel I have to do it and that's it, and there's no reasoning behind it, or there's no sentiment behind it. Remember, it's tied to not only reason but the will, but rather you should have some feeling of esteem or honor for the law, and this is what kind of respect is. You should respect the moral law. For example, a son says, I don't understand why my father wants me to do X, but I respect his feelings, or his decision rather, and so I'll do it. So you see, it's not really that I want to do it. It's not really that I feel that it's going to be beneficial, but I respect this particular decision. I respect the law, and therefore I do it.